My son looked me in the eye and said, "Mom, please don't come to the graduation dinner. It's just easier that way." I nodded. I said okay, and then I went inside and sat at my kitchen table for a long time, staring at the coffee mug he'd given me for Mother's Day 6 years ago, the one that said Best Mom in chipped blue letters. I want to tell you this story from the beginning because the ending won't make sense without it. My name doesn't matter as much as what happened. What matters is that I raised my son alone from the time he was 7 years old, after his father decided that fatherhood was more of a suggestion than a commitment. I worked as a bookkeeper for a medical supply company for 22 years. I drove a used Buick. I packed lunches. I went to every school play, every soccer game, every parent-teacher conference where the teachers told me my son was bright. So bright, if he would just apply himself. He did apply himself. Eventually, by the time he finished his MBA at 31, yes, he went back for it later after working a few years, he was a different person than the boy I'd raised. Not worse, not better. Different. He wore suits. He used words like leverage and synergy without blinking. He'd met a woman named Celeste at a finance conference in Chicago, and she was lovely, truly lovely, with a kind of quiet confidence that comes from never having had to worry about the electric bill. Celeste's family had money, old money, the quiet kind. Her father, Edmund, was a retired partner at a law firm. Her mother hosted charity luncheons. They had a house on a lake in Wisconsin that they called the cottage, even though it had 6 bedrooms. My son fit into that world so smoothly it scared me a little. I told myself I was being foolish. I told myself, this is what you want for your children, for them to build a life better than the one you gave them. I believed that. I still believe it. But there's a difference between building upward and pretending the foundation doesn't exist. The first time I met Celeste, I liked her. She shook my hand with both of hers and said she'd heard so much about me. She asked about my work, my neighborhood, whether I'd always lived in the same city. Real questions, not polite ones. I drove home that night thinking my son had chosen well. The second time I met her, we had dinner at a restaurant I couldn't afford. He paid, he insisted, and I noticed that he introduced me to the waiter, of all people, as my mom she's visiting from out of town. Even though I lived 40 minutes away, visiting, I let it go. The third time was at Edmund and Patricia's. At Celeste's parents' house. A Sunday brunch. I wore my good blouse, the cream one I bought for my niece's wedding 2 years before. I brought a bottle of wine I'd asked the man at the shop to help me choose, something nice, not embarrassing. Edmund took the bottle, glanced at the label, and set it on the counter without comment. Celeste's mother. She told me to call her by her first name, but I've chosen not to write it here, for reasons that will become clear. She was pleasant, but precise. The kind of pleasant that has boundaries inside it. She asked how long I'd been in accounting. She asked where I'd gone to school. When I told her I'd done 2 years of community college and then gotten my certification, she nodded and said, "How practical." My son was across the room laughing with Edmund about something, and he didn't see my face. I drove home and I didn't cry. I was 63 years old. I had raised a child by myself, kept my house, built a life. I was past crying over a word like practical said in a tone like that, but I remembered it. The dinner I mentioned, the graduation dinner, the one he asked me not to attend, was to celebrate his MBA completion. A dinner for 12 at a private room in a downtown restaurant. Celeste's family, a few colleagues, their close friends. It's just that their crowd is it's a work thing too, Mom. It would be awkward. Awkward, I said. I don't mean it like that. How do you mean it? He looked at the floor. He was sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped him with algebra homework, where we'd eaten 1,000 dinners of spaghetti and garlic bread because it was what I could afford and he'd loved it. He looked at that table and he said, "You know what I mean." I did know. That was the part that hurt. I said, "Okay, sweetheart, you go and have a wonderful time." He looked relieved. He squeezed my shoulder on the way out. He said he'd call me the next day. He didn't call for 4 days. When he did, he was warm, breezy, told me the dinner was great, the food was incredible, Edmund had given a toast. I said that sounded lovely. I didn't tell him what I'd found. 2 weeks before the graduation dinner, I'd been trying to pay a bill online and I'd noticed something odd in my savings account. I had a joint account with my son, one I'd set up years ago when he was in his 20s and going through a rough patch, so I could transfer money to him quickly if he needed it, a leftover from a different time. I'd forgotten to close it out, honestly. It had been dormant for years. It wasn't dormant anymore. Over 14 months, 12 withdrawals. Some small, some not small at all. The total, when I added it up on a notepad at my kitchen table, because I needed to write it down to believe it, was a little over $9,000. $9,240. I sat very still. I went through every withdrawal. Some of the dates matched things I knew about. A weekend trip, the engagement ring he'd mentioned buying. One large withdrawal happened 3 days before he booked a venue deposit, a fact I only knew because he'd mentioned it casually in a phone call, not thinking I'd remember. He'd never asked me. He'd never said, "Mom, I need help. Can I borrow something?" He had just taken it, quietly, over more than a year. I thought about all the times I'd said I was fine when he asked how I was doing financially. I thought about the month I'd had to dip into my own emergency fund to cover a car repair, while $900 of mine was sitting in his checking account, moved there while I slept. I didn't call him. I didn't call the bank yet. I called my younger sister, who has always been the sharper one between us, and I told her everything. She said, "Have you talked to him?" I said, "Not yet." She said, "What are you waiting for?" I said, "I'm not sure," but I was sure. I just needed a few more days to understand what I was going to do and why, because there's a difference between reacting and deciding, and I had spent my whole life reacting. I wanted, for once, to decide. I called a woman I know at a local bank branch, not my bank, just someone I'd worked with years ago when I was doing bookkeeping for a client, and I asked her hypothetically, what happens when a joint account holder moves funds without the primary account holder's knowledge? She told me what I needed to know. I thanked her and hung up. Then I called my own bank and removed my son's name from the account. Then I waited. Not to punish him. Or, not only that, I waited because I wanted to see who he was becoming. I wanted to see if he would tell me. I wanted to know if the son I raised, the one who, when he was 9 years old, broke a neighbor's window with a baseball and came home and told me before she even knocked on our door. I wanted to know if that boy was still in there somewhere. The graduation dinner came and went. He didn't tell me. A month passed. He didn't tell me. I went to his apartment for a Sunday visit, and he made brunch, eggs and toast, and the good orange juice, and we talked about Celeste, about their plans to move to a bigger place, about maybe getting a dog. I sat across from him and watched his face, and he was so comfortable, so easy, that I understood something had shifted in him that I hadn't fully seen until that moment. He had decided I didn't need to know. Not just about the money, about his life, about who he was choosing to be. I had become, in his mind, someone to be managed, visited, presented with the edited version. I drove home and I finally cried. Not about the money. The thing that broke it open was not me. Celeste and my son had set a wedding date, the following June, a venue outside the city, the kind of place with stone walls and a garden and a coordinator who sends you a 17-page planning document. I know this because Celeste called me herself, separately from my son, to tell me about the venue and ask if I had any dietary restrictions for the reception menu. I liked her for doing that. During that call, she mentioned, gently, that my son had told her family I had passed away. She said it the way you say something you've been holding carefully for a while. She said, "He told my parents you weren't. He said you'd been gone for a few years. I thought they knew about you. I've talked about you to him. I didn't realize they." She stopped. "I'm so sorry." I don't know why he did that. I was quiet for a long moment. I said, "When did you find out?" She said her mother had asked to see a photo of the two of us together, to include in a memory display at the rehearsal dinner. A display honoring family. When she'd asked my son for a photo with his mother, he'd gone very still, and then everything had unraveled very quickly from there. "He told me this week," she said. "About the money, too." I pushed him until he told me everything. I said, "What did you think when he told you?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I thought I grew up with everything, and I always knew it. I think maybe he was ashamed, but not of you. I think he was ashamed of wanting things he hadn't earned yet. Does that make sense? It made sense. It didn't make it right, but it made sense. Celeste asks me if I was willing to meet, the four of us, me and my son and her and, separately, her parents. She said her father especially needed to understand what had happened because he had been, her word, instrumental in funding certain early wedding deposits based on the understanding that costs were being split a particular way. I told her I would meet, but I told her I needed to speak to my son first, alone. He came to my house on a Thursday evening. He had clearly not slept well. He sat at the kitchen table. Always that table. And for a while he just looked at his hands. I didn't make it easy for him. I let the silence do its work. When he finally spoke, he said, I don't know how to explain it in a way that doesn't sound like an excuse. I said, try without the excuses then. He talked for a long time. About feeling like two people. The person he grew up as and the person he was trying to become. About being embarrassed. Not of me, he said, but of his own hunger for a different life. A life that felt like it cost something to want. About telling a lie once, to Edmund, early on, and then not being able to find a way back from it. About the money. He said the money was inexcusable, he knew that. He hadn't let himself think too clearly about it, because if he had, he would have had to stop, and he'd needed it and told himself he would put it back. Did you? I asked. He said no. I said, you have 2 months of savings in that account that isn't yours. The rest, I'd like back within a year. I'll put it in writing and so will you, and if you miss a payment, I'll treat it as what it is. He nodded. He didn't argue. That told me something. Then I said, the other thing. You told them I was dead. He couldn't look at me. I said, I'm going to need you to sit with that for a while. Not for me to forgive you. I'll get there, I think. But I need you to understand what you did. You erased me. You didn't just hide me. You erased me. He said, I know. I said, I need to hear you say it like you know it. He said, I erased you. I'm ashamed of it. I'm going to spend a long time being ashamed of it. That was enough, not to fix it, but enough to start. The meeting with Edmund and his wife was not what I expected. I had imagined something stiff and formal, a confrontation where I would have to defend my son while also condemning what he'd done. I had imagined Edmund looking at me with that same expression he'd had when he set my wine bottle on the counter. Instead, he opened the door himself, and the first thing he said was, I owe you an apology. It turned out that Edmund, who had grown up in a small town in Ohio and had worked his way into law school on scholarships and sheer stubbornness, had recognized my son's behavior with a clarity that I hadn't expected. He had seen, he said, the particular shape of a man trying to outrun where he came from because he had done it himself decades ago, before he'd learned that outrunning it only makes you tired. I should have asked more questions, he said. When he told me you were gone, I should have. He shook his head. I took him at his word because it was easier. I'm not without responsibility here. His wife, to her credit, was quiet, and then she said, I think I also made certain things harder than they needed to be. Not intentionally, but I can see it now. That was more than I'd expected from her. I thanked her for saying it. We sat together for 2 hours. We talked about the wedding, about what it would look like now that the truth was on the table. Edmund said he'd be reevaluating the financial arrangements given what had come to light. My son looked pale, but he sat through all of it. At the end, Celeste reached across the table and took my hand. She said, I would really like you to be at my wedding. I said, I would really like to be there. The wedding happened on a Saturday in June. Stone walls, garden, the whole thing. I wore a blue dress I bought specifically for the occasion, not the practical kind, the kind you buy because you want to feel like yourself on a day that matters. Edmund walked Celeste down the aisle, and when he passed me, sitting in the second row on my son's side, he nodded at me with something that I can only describe as respect. My son stood at the altar and he cried when he saw Celeste. He's always cried easily. When he was small, he cried at the end of movies, at the end of books, even at commercials sometimes. I used to tease him about it. I didn't tease him that day. I thought, that's still my boy. Right there. That's him. When the ceremony was done, he came directly to me before anyone else. He hugged me for a long time, longer than he had since he was a teenager and too old for it, and he said into my shoulder, "Thank you for coming." I said, "Did you think I wouldn't?" He said, "I wasn't sure I deserved it." I pulled back and looked at him. I said, "You're going to spend the rest of your life making sure you do, and I'm going to be here watching." He laughed. It was a watery laugh, the kind that comes right after you've been crying. And it was the most like himself he'd sounded in years. "He's paying me back on time every month, the way we agreed. We have a document signed, and I have a copy, and so does he. I didn't do it to hold it over him. I did it because a loan without structure is a wound that never closes, and I've made enough of those in my life. Celeste and I have coffee sometimes, just the two of us, when she's passing through my part of the city. She's good for him, not because of her family or her background or any of the things my son thought he needed, but because she's honest, and she expected honesty from him, and she didn't let it go when it wasn't there. Edmund called me once, a few months after the wedding, just to check in. He said Celeste talks about me often. He said he hoped the families could be close. I said I hope so too, and I meant it. I think about that version of my son, the one who sat at my table and decided not to tell me, who withdrew money in the middle of the night while I was asleep and told himself it was fine, who looked at the woman who raised him and calculated that she was more useful as a secret than as a mother. I think about that version, and I know he was afraid. Afraid of not being enough, afraid of wanting too much, afraid that the gap between where he started and where he was trying to go was too wide to cross honestly. But fear doesn't get to be an excuse. You can understand something and still name it correctly. What he did was wrong, not complicated. Wrong. And what I did, choosing to wait, choosing to speak when I was ready, instead of when I was raw. That was the first time in my life I truly chose myself over the moment. I'm 64 years old. It took this long to learn it. If you're a mother watching this, I want to say something carefully. Loving your children doesn't mean disappearing for them. It doesn't mean making yourself smaller so they can look bigger. It doesn't mean accepting an edited version of yourself in their lives. You raised them. You are the foundation. And if they build something beautiful on top of it, the right thing to do is be proud, and also to remain standing. I'm still standing. That's the whole story. I've been thinking about what it means to act with integrity when no one is watching. Not because someone will find out. Not because there's a reward waiting. But because the person you are in private is the only real version of you that exists. My son learned that the hard way. And I say that without pleasure. He is a smart man. Genuinely smart. He worked for everything he has, and I watched him do it, and I was proud every single step of the way. But somewhere along the road, intelligence without honesty started to feel like enough to him. He thought he could architect a life using borrowed money and borrowed truth, and that if he built it carefully enough, no one would ever look too closely at the foundation. That's not intelligence. That's cleverness. And there's a difference that took me decades to fully understand. Intelligence asks, what is true, and what does that require of me? Cleverness asks, what can I get away with? My son, for a period of his life, was choosing cleverness, and it almost cost him everything. Not the wedding, not the money, not even Celeste, though all of those were at risk. It almost cost him his own self-respect, which is the one thing no one else can give back to you once it's gone. What I did, waiting, staying quiet, removing my name from the account and then watching, that wasn't passive. People have asked me, hearing this story, why I didn't confront him immediately, why I let months go by. I understand the question, but I had spent 63 years reacting to things as they hit me, saying the first true thing that came to mind, and sometimes the first true thing is not the most useful thing. I wanted, for once, to decide, to choose my moment, to speak from a place of clarity instead of hurt. That took something out of me that I'm still rebuilding. Sitting across from my son at that kitchen table, watching him eat the eggs he've made, knowing what I knew, that required a kind of discipline I hadn't known I had. Not coldness. Discipline. There's a difference there too. And Edmund, I didn't expect him. I didn't expect a man from that world to look at what my son had done and say, plainly, that he understood it, because he'd felt the same pull once, that hunger to outrun where you started. He didn't excuse it. He named it, and then he said it wasn't enough. That took character. I respect him for it. The part I want to leave you with is this: the truth didn't need my help. I didn't engineer the moment when Celeste's mother asked for a family photograph. I didn't arrange for everything to surface the way it did. I just stopped hiding it for him. I stopped making myself smaller so his lie could stay standing. And once I did that, the whole structure he built couldn't hold. That's how it works. Not as punishment, just as consequence. The things we build on false ground don't last, and no amount of intelligence or planning changes that. It's not a rule someone made up. It's just the nature of what's real. My son is a good man finding his way back to being an honest one. I believe that. I'm watching it happen. Payment by payment, phone call by phone call, Sunday brunch by Sunday brunch. And I'm still standing at 64, which is, honestly, the best thing I can say.